Today's episode is brought to you by the Daily Gardener Friday newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about garden history and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is April 24th. I hope you like the new intro music to the show. I've added a few new features to the show today as part of the relaunch for the podcast. I ended up taking a little bit of a break, a longer break than what I anticipated, and I have stored up a number of different stories to share with you. It does feel good to be back. I can hardly believe that we are almost talking about May, and yet here in Minnesota, we've really been robbed of our shoulder season of spring this year. You know, we went into the winter in a tremendous drought. August was really rough on trees and shrubs and for landscapers who were putting in new installations because it was so hot, it was so windy and dry. That combination did not set us up well for going into winter. Our first couple of snowfalls were very severe. They were super heavy, really wet snow. And you could just see it was so hard on so many trees. It was especially hard on the arborvitae. They immediately started flopping and just getting weighed down by the snow. Up at the cabin, you could see the impact on the white pines. You could see it on the birch trees. And then just trees and shrubs in general. It was really tough on them. We got through Christmas time, and then we thought, okay, maybe we're in for a reprieve. And that was not the case. It was one of the most snowy winters on record. And then about a couple of weeks ago, we had about 5 days that were over 80. So we just slammed right into summer, and then winter had the last laugh. It was a couple of weeks into April here, and we got blasted again with another big, heavy, wet snow. That last snow, I remember it was a Sunday. It was April 16th. It was my neighbor's birthday. And I think everybody just woke up, looked outside, and saw that significant snowfall yet again, another really heavy snow, and just shook their heads in total disbelief. And I tell you what, the trees and the shrubs that were able to withstand this winter, well, many of them gave up the ghost. They were done. It was just too much for them. And then up at the cabin last Wednesday, we had straight line winds. So just this combination of weather events that we were having, and next thing you know, we have big trees going down. So it's just been a bad sequence of events. So I predict for Minnesota gardeners that this year will be a season of replanting, of replacing, and hopefully reinvigorating some of our landscapes, some of our gardens. And I hope that for many of you that you choose the latter, especially when it comes to arborvitae. I don't think that they are a good tree to use up here in Minnesota, the emerald green arborvitae in particular. They are just too fragile. The environment, I think, is just too much for them. And I think they're a lousy investment for homeowners who have to continually replace them. They're just so frustrating. So I would advocate getting a privacy fence if you're looking to use them as a screen. And if you're looking for something to give you that green mass as a background, consider other plant material in the landscape. And that's one of the things that I plan to talk about on the show, alternatives to arborvitae or maybe more traditional selections in our landscape that are not serving us well. You know, April 24th, I had a funny little thing flash up on my computer this morning, and it was on this day, back in 1982, that Jane Fonda's very first workout video was released. Do you remember that series? Well, anyway, hopefully we can use that as inspiration to get out and spend some time in our gardens today, get a little workout in. Hopefully the weather will cooperate where you are. You know, the other little tidbit that I heard this morning as I was getting ready was a fun little fact about limes and lemons. And it turns out that limes are more dense than lemons. And one of the ways that you can prove that is by getting a glass of water. And if you put the lime in, it will sink to the bottom of the glass. But if you put a lemon in a glass of water, it will float. So there you go, a little fun party trick for you and the kids. All right, let's get to today's garden history. All right, we kick things off for botanical history today with a German original thinker, Jacob Boehme. And he did a great deal of thinking and writing, not only about theology and Christianity, but also about the natural world. In fact, here's what Mary Oliver wrote about Boehme. She wrote, "I read Jacob Boehme and am caught in his shining web. Here are desire and will that should be," he says, "as two arms at one task. In my life, they are less cooperative. Will keeps sliding away down the hill to play when work is called for, and desire piously wants to labor when the best season of merriment is around me." Troublemakers, both of them. And another writer I admire and enjoy is Elizabeth Gilbert, and she wrote about Jacob Boehme in her book, The Signature of All Things. In fact, she got the title of her book from something that Jacob Boehme had written. And so here's what she wrote about Jacob in her book, The Signature of All Things. Jacob Boehme was a 16th century cobbler from Germany who had mystical visions about plants. Many people considered him an early botanist. Alma's mother, on the other hand, had considered him a cesspool of residual medieval superstition. So there was considerable conflict of opinion surrounding Jacob Boehme. The old cobbler believed in something that he called the signature of all things, that God had hidden clues for humanity's betterment inside the design of every flower, leaf, fruit, and tree on earth. All the natural world was a divine code containing proof of our Creator's love. And today we also raise a glass to Robert Bailey Thomas. He was born on this day, April 24th in 1766, and I bet you have a copy of one of his books laying around. And if you don't, probably mom or dad or a neighbor, somebody near you does. He was the founder, editor, and publisher of the Old Farmer's Almanac, and he made his first edition, his very first copy, back in 1792, Robert Bailey Thomas. And today we also toast a man whose life's work became synonymous with the cherry trees that bloomed in Washington, D.C. And of course, we're talking about the botanist Paul George Russell, who was born in Liverpool, New York on this day, April 24th in 1889. Paul worked as a botanist for the United States government for over 5 decades. Paul George Russell went on collecting trips in northern Mexico. He's remembered in the naming of a number of different plants, including the Verbena russellii, which is a woody flowering plant, very pretty. And he's also remembered in the naming of the Opuntia russellii, which is a type of prickly pear cactus, which was also named for him. Now, during Paul George Russell's career, he could identify plants based on what their seeds looked like. And one of the ways that he developed this skill is he compiled a seed bank of over 40,000 different types of seeds. But he is most remembered for his work, as I mentioned, with cherry trees. He was a vital part of the team that was created to install the living architecture of Japanese cherry trees around the Washington tidal basin. And he put together a little bulletin, a little USDA circular that was called Oriental Flowering Cherries, back in March of 1934. It was his most impressive work. It provided all kinds of facts and detailed information about the trees. People were very curious about them and just completely in love with them once they saw the magnificent cherry trees blooming in springtime around the basin in Washington, D.C. Paul George Russell passed away at the age of 73. He had a heart attack. And in a poignant note, he was supposed to see his beloved cherry trees in bloom with his daughter. They had planned a trip to go to the tidal basin together, but unfortunately, that last visit never happened. So this year, when you see the cherry trees in bloom, raise a trowel to Paul George Russell. Remember him and his fine work. And if you can, get your hands on a copy of that 72-page circular that he created way back in 1934. It's all still good information. And today we remember Charles Sprague Sargent, the American botanist who was the first director of Harvard University's Arnold Arboretum. He was born on this day, April 24th in 1841. He was known for being a little curmudgeon-y. He was kind of stoic. One of my favorite stories about Charles was the day he went on an exploration of mountains, and the botanist that he was with could hardly contain himself at a particular spot of beauty. And this botanist is jumping around and shouting for joy. And he looks over at Charles Sprague Sargent and says something to the effect of, "How can you stand there and say and do nothing in the midst of all of this incredible beauty?" One of my favorite stories about Charles Sprague Sargent. It was on this day, April 24th, in 1914, that a man named James Bates observed a deep violet patch of blooming flowers in an alfalfa field in Arcadia Valley County in Nebraska. And James wrote about the experience in a publication called The American Botanist. Well, the plant that James was writing about was Chorospora tenella, that's in the mustard family, and it's known by several common names, including purple mustard or musk mustard, or the crossflower, because, of course, it's a crucifer, meaning the flowers are in that cross shape. Now, that name, musk flower, has to do with the fragrance, the smell. In fact, on a website for Colorado wildflowers, the author wrote, "I think they smell of Crayola crayons warmed and melting in the sun. And so I call this plant the crayon plant." So purple mustard or musk flower, however you call it, is actually an edible, in case you were wondering. The Backyard Forager writes that you can snip the top 4 to 6 inches off of each plant, including the flowers, which are not only edible, but pretty. Now, you might be asking yourself, how could I use purple mustard? And Feast magazine says this: purple mustard can be used much the same way as you would other mustards. Spread some on your next arugula sandwich. Serve it alongside pickles and crusty bread with charcuterie. Whisk a teaspoon into your vinaigrettes instead of Dijon. So there are some uses for your purple mustard. Today, we also travel back in time to Vassar College. It was on this day, April 24th, back in 1916, that Vassar decided to honor Shakespeare on the 300th anniversary of his death. And so students from Winifred Smith's Shakespeare class and Emmeline Moore's botany class planted pansies. And of course, Shakespeare referred to pansies as the flower for thoughts, a flower that can withstand the cold. It has a chemical that is essentially nature's antifreeze that allows it to withstand those cold temperatures. The Canadian naturalist Charles Joseph Sariel once said that he felt that pansies should be grown from seed. Beatrix Potter liked pansies, and the happy poet Edgar Albert Guest wrote about pansies in his poem called To Plant a Garden. And one of the verses says, "If you'd get away from boredom and find new delights to look for, learn the joy of budding pansies, which you've kept a special nook for." Pansies are a happy flower and a great way to honor Shakespeare. And finally, it was on this day, April 24th in 1919, that the great botanist Ernest H. Wilson was working at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and he excitedly shared that he was getting a shipment of Kurume azaleas from Japan, and he was very excited about it. Ernest wrote, 104 azaleas were unpacked at the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard, and all were found to be alive. And considering the length of their journey, they were in good condition. Ernest alludes to the fact that he had to work on nurturing his relationship with his growers and his gardeners. These particular azaleas were grown by a Japanese gardener who had, quote, a reluctance to part with them. And so the fact that they actually came to America was in no small measure due to the relationship building skills of Ernest Henry Wilson, something that doesn't often get enough attention when we think about plant explorers. And that's today's garden history. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Tiny and Wild, by Graham Laird Gardner, who, by the way, has the perfect last name for a garden author, Gardner. I mean, how'd that happen? Well, in any case, this is a beautiful book. It's one of the prettiest books for gardeners to come out this year. And the subtitle is Build a Small-Scale Meadow Anywhere. So, of course, we're talking about creating tiny meadows on your property. Well, this cover had to be appealing. There are a lot of attractive purple flowers in meadows, of course. So what's great about the cover of this book is they show how you can integrate wildflowers, flowers that you will find in meadows, in your outdoor living spaces, in your garden designs, and how those flowers play such an important role in our ecosystems. Now, Graham kicks things off in this book by asking, why a mini meadow? And here's what he writes, and then I'm going to share my own thoughts on why a mini meadow might be just the ticket for your garden. Graham writes, you've heard the calling for a more resilient, biodiverse garden, full of flowers and movement that's inspired by natural plant communities and the wild spaces around you. Perhaps you feel a sense of nostalgia for the wilderness of your childhood or need to invite wild places home. Do you have a balcony or an underperforming section of yard? Maybe you have an area of lawn you'd like to convert, or a section of your veggie plot you'd like to devote to attracting more pollinators and other beneficial insects. However, you're not quite sure where to begin. And so, of course, mini meadows might just be the solution that you've been looking for. Now, when I think about answering the question, why mini meadows? I think the timing is right. In terms of design, we've all had some exposure to Pete Outall's gardens. And of course, he's been incorporating things like grasses and wildflowers for so long. He's been painting our public spaces with his version of meadows, beautiful, beautiful meadows that are hand-picked and planted to maximize beauty. And so I think gardeners are ready for this. In fact, just the other day, I was talking to my neighbor across the street, and she has a common pond area that she shares with other neighbors. And for most of the year, it can be rather unsightly, especially if we're going through a drought. And so she was wondering what they can do, what they should be planting. And I think the answer is really found in this book with many of the plants that would go in a meadow. So all kinds of grasses, all kinds of wildflowers, and of course, incorporating lots of native plants and really embracing the wildness that you find along so many of our waterways, whether it's a river or a brook or a pond, for instance. Now, the chapters in this book are as follows. First, find inspiration in your parks and your plant communities that are around you. The second chapter talks about the importance of site selection. Don't underestimate this because, as the saying goes for real estate and for houses, well, the same thing goes for how you're going to home your plants. You need to think about location, location, location. Then the third chapter talks about design tips for your mini meadow, how you can combine the beauty and the function of this meadow in your garden. And then the next couple chapters get into the nitty-gritty of installing a meadow, which really isn't as hard as it sounds, but it's great to have a detailed guide like this to help you remember all of the little details. Chapter 6 talks about how to maintain your meadow, probably the most important chapter in the book, and it's where the bulk of your annual labors will come into play. And then chapter 7 is the fun chapter. It's what to plant. And here Graham shares a bunch of different plant lists and charts so that you can pick the perfect plants for your tiny meadow. I love that. So in the past couple of years, you've heard me talk about planting mini orchards, reforesting, putting together little mini forests on your property. And now we are here. We are building tiny and wild meadows in our gardens. You can get a copy of Tiny and Wild by Graham Laird Gardner and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $17. Well, we end the show today with a touching little story that was featured in the Irish Times. It was on this day, April 24th in 1916, that a small garden known as Foundation Stone was installed at Farmley House in Phoenix Park. A man named Patrick Pierce helped christen the garden with a little speech. And now what is special about this garden is that it was a reflection of the solar system on that very day. So the planets and their alignment is perfectly represented by 9 lichen-covered boulders that were positioned in such a way that they would perfectly orbit a granite bowl, which of course represented the sun. Now, this garden was very simple. In addition to the boulders and the granite bowl, there are simply circular ripples of grass around the boulders. They actually help accentuate their position in the garden and, of course, in the night sky. Now, what I love about this garden is that it perfectly illustrates that there is no end to the amount of creativity that we can use when it comes to garden design. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Gardener. Don't forget that you can toast today's garden history by getting a copy of The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert, or by simply flipping through the latest version of the Farmer's Almanac. And just a reminder that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. The next time you're over at Facebook, just search for Daily Gardener Community, where you'd search for a friend and then request to join. And if you'd like more of The Daily Gardener, you can subscribe to the newsletter over at thedailygardener.org. Don't forget that you can also show your support for the show by using the Buy Me a Coffee link over at the website or in today's show notes. This is Jennifer Ebling. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day.
podcast.